Okay, so thank you for joining me today. I'm very excited to be able to talk to you about media literacy, which is a very important subject. So, Matteo, you are the CEO and founder of Shout Out UK, which is a multi-award winning education platform and also a creative social enterprise. Can you tell us a bit more about what prompted you to create Shout Out UK and what are your missions?
Sure. So I created Shout at UK a little bit before 2015 and then officially incorporated as a social enterprise in the summer of 2015. And what spurred me on was it's a couple of things. So one was that my mum, who's an Italian migrant in the UK, was always quite interested in politics, never went into it herself or anything like that, but just talked to me about it on occasion. And I wanted to gained an interest from that. I wanted to learn about the system that we live under here in the UK. And unfortunately, at the moment, there is no subject that teaches politics in schools in the UK. So it's quite easy for anybody to hit 18 and never have an understanding of how our parliament functions, what is first past the post, how a bill becomes a law, what the role of the monarchy is, all these kind of bare bone basic things that frankly in a functioning democracy should be taught to every person that then becomes eligible to vote. So that almost felt a bit odd to me that we don't have that information in schools. Then I was lucky enough to go to a A-level college that taught government politics as an A-level when I was 17, found a real passion for it, interested in it, studied it at university, and that kind of spurred me to be like, actually, there is a massive gap in our educational system. And when I say a massive gap, I mean, not just in understanding our political system, but also how to be critically engaged with that system. And those kind of two terms I kind of understood as political literacy and media literacy. Political literacy being, again, understanding the bare bone basics around how our democracy functions. So all the things I previously mentioned. And then media literacy, which for me goes hand in hand with political literacy, about how to critically analyze the information received. Because it's one thing understanding the system and understanding the system you live under, but then without that critical understanding of the information you receive to then make informed choices around voting or wherever else, you're kind of stuck. So you need both of these things to be able to be a critically engaged citizen. I think if you want to be a truly functioning democracy, you must give everybody, regardless of class, race, religion, ethnicity, gender, whatever, the ability to understand the system and to critically analyze the information you receive. So that kind of spurred me onto creating Shout Out UK.
So I've of course looked a bit at your website, and the majority of the writers are fairly young. So is that your idea of how the news going forward should be spread, with youth people writing for the youth, by the youth?
Not so much about news, because there's a difference between, I think, news and commentary. So the way we as an organization operate is that we run political and media literacy programs now in secondary schools and colleges. We've run them in over 1,000 schools across the UK. And then those young people are given a platform, which is on the website that you mentioned, to voice opinion, share thoughts about something, and debate essentially about a variety of different issues. But that's not necessarily journalism. And I think it's important to identify what is comment and opinion and what is journalism. Journalism is written by essentially experts, professionals that have a load of checks and balances around them, that have a set of ethos and so forth. Unfortunately, certain publications don't tend to follow said ethos. And then comment is your own opinion. And I think it's important for us to differentiate the two, but also give everybody a platform to have that opinion and voice. And quite often we see the same old type of people get promotions in media. And what we want to do is give young people that information to be critical thinkers in news and politics and so forth, and then give them a platform to voice their opinion. But it is very much comment and opinion.
So if we look at the National Association for Media Literacy Education, it defines media literacy as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and create and act using all forms of communication. So the idea behind this is to make us think more critically about the media that we're using. Why is it important to know how all of this works?
For so many reasons. I mean, you can take Brexit as a prime example of the importance of understanding the media, understanding the information you receive. We're at the moment seeing what's unfolding in the US with the level of misinformation that's potentially influencing their election. Media literacy is, I think, a fundamental pillar of democracy. If you want to live in a democratic society, people need to be able to critically analyze the information they receive, not just to make voting choices, but it could be things around taxation, it could be things around jobs, whatever it may be. We live in a world now where most of our information comes from essentially social media. Like we scroll through Twitter, we scroll through Facebook, we scroll through Instagram, LinkedIn, Snapchat, you name it. And it's really hard for us to, in those platforms, to differentiate what is good fact-based information, what isn't, what is a journalistic piece, what is a comment piece, because it all looks vaguely the same. Mm-hmm. And media literacy gives us the ability to be able to identify what these pieces are trying to tell us. Are they trying to influence you to buy a product? Are they trying to influence you to hate or support a certain group? Are they trying to influence you to vote for someone? These are all really, really important things. They've always been important because propaganda and misinformation to some extent have always existed. But with the birth of social media, it has supercharged it massively. And when we've got, I mean, even another example, looking at things like the pandemic, for example, media literacy is not just about politics and democracy, but it's about public safety. Mm-hmm. Because again, if you start looking at bits of information that because you're scared or because you're worried, you start to believe, but they are essentially false, you can end up potentially damaging yourself, hurting a loved one or whatever else because you are following the wrong guidelines. So it's also about looking at, okay, well, where did this bit of information come from? Should I trust this random screenshot of this random statistic that my auntie sent on WhatsApp? Or should I trust the government guidelines? Where can I find the government guidelines? Mm-hmm. Should I trust this article if it's in the Times? Okay, well, if it's in the Times, is it an actual journalistic piece in the Times, or is it a comment piece by someone? There's nothing wrong with comment pieces. But you got to understand that it's an opinion. This is not fact. This is someone's opinion. It's opinion that you might agree with. At the end of the day, it is an opinion. So media literacy is super important for all of these different elements, from understanding how to deal with a pandemic, to understanding how to vote and what to allow yourself to be influenced by during an election, or anything in between. And now that we take most of our information from online, it takes nothing or next to nothing to create a website, make it look as beautiful as the BBC's website or the Guardian's or the Times's or whatever, and start putting out misinformation. So the bar is super low now to start spreading anything, essentially. So we as consumers need to become more critical, not cynical, but critical when we're looking at things like, what is this thing trying to tell me? What is this bit of information trying to say? Is it an actual factual journalistic piece, or is it trying to influence me in a certain way?
That's a very good point, especially because this makes me think of recently, because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the elections in the US, for example, we've started to see more and more on Facebook or on Twitter, this information, saying at the bottom of a tweet, for example, let's talk about Trump, saying, this could be this is misinformation, this has not been checked. So that's very interesting because, for example, in the UK, in 2004, the then Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Tisa Jawol, she predicted that the media literacy would become as important a skill as math or science. Yet it's been 6 years in policy in the making, but there's not been much change. So why is that the case? Why is it so long to evolve? Especially because the spread of fake news has just boomed.
No, definitely. I think there's two theories I have for that, and they're theories because your guess is as good as mine as to why this hasn't been taken seriously by policymakers in general. I would say it's the same reasoning behind. One of them is the same reasoning as political literacy. Why that hasn't been actively pushed through in policymaking circles, and I think it's seen as controversial because it's, again, for balance. People always say, both sides in the Brexit debate, for example, had misinformation. That is factually inaccurate. The Brexiteer side has statistically a lot more misinformation and used a lot more misinformation tactics than the Remain side. That is just fact. It's an inconvenient fact and it's a very damaging fact, but it's true. And I feel like with policymakers and government, whenever you start to talk about media literacy or political literacy, you start to feel like you're attacking one specific side.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be seen as very controversial. I think there's been a bit of resistance because of that. Whenever you talk about media literacy, it seems like you're targeting a specific group consistently, and partly because one specific group tends to use it a lot more than the other side. The other thing specifically with media literacy, I feel like it's something that the government just has an issue with when it comes to anything to do with digital. I remember I gave evidence to the House of Lords just before lockdown. It was a very weird experience of walking through Parliament and there's literally nobody around.
I can imagine.
It was surreal. But I remember doing that, and they were asking me questions about, for example, talking about newspapers. Like, oh, how can we get young people to start reading newspapers more? And it's like, that's not gonna happen. Like, social media is here to stay. Technology is here to stay. You not seeing it as the norm because you're from a different age is one thing, but trying to bring that back is almost very counterproductive. So that's the kind of mentality, especially in the UK Parliament, that I've seen. And it's not just to do with media literacy. It could be to do with how to legislate in regards to tech giants, how to get Google, for example, to stop making money off of flat earthers and anti-vaxxers, for instance, which has been a massive struggle. And nothing really has been done, despite consistently being exposed of taking millions from these organizations, or rather from these conspiracy theorists. And there's just a massively fundamental misunderstanding in, I think, politics, and that's partly to do with the fact that there are a lot less youth voices, and this is why we as an organization are pushing youth opinion, because it's not journalism, it's opinion. But the problem is that the next generation's opinion tends to be always left out of the conversation, and it's young people that have a massive understanding on tech, on understanding social media and things like that, which government, who tends to have a slightly older generation, that's not a problem. But when you don't include a massive section of society who have just a better and are more tech savvy than yourselves, you start to legislate for the wrong things, or you start to focus on the wrong things. So I think media literacy has kind of been caught in this weird bubble almost, where all of these different things around tech have been caught, where there's just a massive lack of understanding about technology, the internet things, and all these kind of aspects that are almost beyond the scope of politicians, just purely because they didn't grow up in this age. For them, you know, I remember there was this amazing committee hearing in the States where one, I think, senator asked Mark Zuckerberg, for example, how do you sending emails via WhatsApp? Like that's, I mean, it's funny, but it's also really telling of a fundamental problem that when you're trying to legislate on something like media literacy or digital skills or things like this, if you have that little an understanding of that sector, you also have a very, very narrow understanding of the problem. And how can you legislate on a problem you don't understand? So there's a lot of hesitance, partly because of this lack of understanding or experience.
Definitely, that's actually very interesting, because we know that social media and online gaming and the internet, it's become very addictive, and there's not much that we can do about it. But the older generation is always asking the younger one, what would you do differently, and in which way would it be possible to get them to read the newspaper? But the reality of it is that, yes, we have been used to reading the news online and to getting information by the hour. So that's extremely difficult to try and conciliate the two. So that's very interesting to talk about. How would you say, in broad terms, how social media affected journalism?
Really badly, I'd say. Really badly. to be completely frank. I'm not going to just leave it at that. But yeah, no, really badly. And the reason why I say that is because social media, like you've said earlier, it's created a culture of I want things now. And it's not just social media. You see this with, you know, Amazon deliveries, or our culture is very much, we want it now. We don't really want to wait. And that's kind of fine for products and things. But when it comes to news and information, that kind of race to be the first has meant that accuracy has kind of gone out the window. Doesn't matter how accurate you are or how inaccurate you are. All that matters is you're the first to break the scoop. And that's massively problematic. And social media has contributed to that, because now anybody can technically be a journalist in the sense that they can put out a story or they can put out an image of a riot or something and start talking about it. But how do you know that image is verified? Where did that image come from? Was it from now? Was it from 2016? You know, there were some images that we saw that were talking about BLM quite recently, and they turned out to be from the Ferguson riots years ago. And that was just completely misinformed. So social media has created this massive online conversation, which journalists are jumping on board and wanting to be the first to break stories and all the rest of it. But you have to sacrifice accuracy for speed, and that's something that social media has contributed to. And that's something that one thing that actually I would argue that we do need to change is our relationship with news. And what I mean by that is that rather than wanting to be the first to be like, I've seen this article, it's going to say that, I don't know, X candidate's winning or whatever, rather than sharing it with all your friends, try and see if it's actually accurate and maybe wait a little bit longer and then share the more accurate, factually based version. We've got to stop glorifying being the first to tell a story and being the person to tell it right. And I think that fundamental change needs to happen. And that's something that social media is kind of skewed, and we need to kind of bring that back. But that's a cultural change within ourselves and within, I think, us as consumers that we need to change. And the way you do that is through political and media literacy in schools. The other thing I would say with social media, which is a financial one, is I think that Google and Facebook have completely decimated the advertising industry, and not for the advertisers, but for publications. And before, journalists used to, newspapers used to make money through advertising on their platform, etc. Whereas now it's so much cheaper, so much more accurate. You can really pinpoint your audience on Facebook and Google. Why would you advertise on a newspaper? And it's no one's fault, really. That's just technology, and media hasn't found the way of generating revenue in that same respect. But the loss of income through things like Facebook and Google, who pretty much dominate, by the way, like Facebook and Google pretty much own most of the advertising market, is that when that happens, you start to have a lot of income drops in newspapers and so forth, so therefore a lot of layoffs, less journalists, less money to do investigative stories, and everything almost became kind of BuzzFeedy pieces that would just get clicks, and therefore more clicks, more money. So it's almost like the kind of race to the bottom of journalism kind of came out of desperation, as well as this kind of wanting everything now kind of culture. So it's pretty damaging, but it's not technology's fault. It's just that journalism hasn't really developed a new avenue to deal with the technological innovation that's happened in other areas.
Right. This actually reminds me of something. I'm not sure if you've watched the documentary, The Social Dilemma.
I haven't yet. People have been telling me so much to watch it, and I've been meaning to watch it. It's just that, with work and everything else, I just haven't, but I need to.
You should. It's actually a very interesting piece because, so I'm not going to spoil it for you because you already know what it's about, basically. But for me, it was very interesting to watch because, so they basically explain to people who are not used to using, to really seeing like behind the curtains of what social media are, is that when you get a notification and it's going to tell you, your friend posted this, maybe you want to have a look, and then you're going to go online, and then you're going to start scrolling, and then you're going to see advertisements and such and such. And it was very interesting because a lot of my friends who watched the movie, and then they said, this is frightening. I had no idea that I was giving them so much information. And this is, I think for me, it really reflects on how poorly educated we are on the matter of social media and on media literacy in general, because we think, I'm putting out there this picture of my vacation, but then we don't know that they are actually using this to promote or push, products or anything else afterwards. So that was actually interesting. I think you would like the documentary.
No, definitely. And that's something that we talk about media literacy, or we say there's two things here. One is social media aggregation, which is essentially what you describe, where if you buy a pair of shoes online, you will start to see loads of random adverts about shoes and whatever else, which is fine. Like it's not ideal, but it's also kind of harmless as long as you don't have a compulsion to buy things. You're pretty much going to be all right. The problem lies when it comes to things like news around elections or news around specific issues or whatever else. And the problem gets amplified because, say, for example, in that shoe scenario, you take away the shoe and you replace it with, I don't know, a pro-EU article. Soon, eventually, if you keep clicking on them, you will end up seeing only things around pro-EU topics, which is not the reality of the way the world thinks. In the same way that if you were clicking on issues that were pro-Brexit, for example, anti-EU, your world ends up being that. And you can have two people living two doors down from each other, and their view of the world will be completely different courtesy of that aggregation. What makes it worse, I think, is bias. And we all, and this is an uncomfortable topic to have, but I think it's an important one because we all have biases. If you were to ask me what dessert you should have for dinner, I'm going to say something to do with chocolate because that's something I like. It's a bias that I have. It's a harmless bias, but it's a bias I have. And we all have to understand that we all have biases to things, people, whatever. Some of them are harmless, like that one. Others can be more harmful when it comes to things like race, religion, gender, or whatever else. And those biases influence how critical we are with specific articles. So when you see something on social media and you're being aggregated to see a certain thing, if you want to believe that the EU is this corrupt whatever, you are going to be less likely to critically analyze that article because you want it to be true. Your bar of critical analysis is going to be lower. Whereas if you see an article that's pro-EU or says that EU is, community building, whatever, you're going to criticize that article more. You're going to purposely try and find holes in that article because you don't want that to be true. So that kind of leads us in a certain path. And we've got to, when it comes to bias, we've got to have this understanding of what kind of biases we have and understand that as human beings, you will have bias, but it's about a matter of how to deal with them on a regular basis. And I remember I ran this podcast called Media Minded during lockdown. And one of the people that we spoke to was the national coordinator for Media Literacy Ireland, Martina Chapman, and she compared it to BO, body odor. And I love this analogy. I think it's spot on. Like, bias is something that we consistently have, almost like BO. We all have BO. If we don't wash, we will begin to smell. And pretty much accepted universal fact. So we don't wait until someone, turns around in the office and taps you on the shoulder and says, look, like, I can't be sitting next to you anymore. You're making my head dizzy with your smell. Go wash. You don't want to wait for someone to do that. You will regularly wash to make sure that you don't stink. In the same way, we regularly critically analyze ourselves and our internal biases to make sure that our opinions don't stink of bias and making sure that we don't end up influencing ourselves in a specific skewed way based on our bias. And it's something that consistently needs to happen and be learned.
So essentially, this is confirmation bias, right?
Confirmation bias. Yeah.
Okay. So would you say that because of that, the consumer actually has more responsibility to what they're reading or what they're doing online?
I'd say there is a huge responsibility in the consumer, yes. But you can't have responsibility on something that you haven't been trained to deal with. And that's the fundamental problem where we go back to media and political literacy. It's like, how can you be held responsible on something you don't know how to do?
Exactly.
It's almost like saying you're responsible to drive a car, but we're not going to teach you lessons. That doesn't make sense. Sure. You're not going to blame someone for crashing a car when you give them a car and say drive, but I'm not going to teach you. No one's going to teach you how to do it. Do you know what I mean? Like it doesn't make sense.
Definitely.
So yes, the consumer has responsibility, but only once we make sure that this is a statutory subject in school so that everybody has these tools. And then it's our responsibility to use them. And also, I do believe that there is a responsibility within government to legislate to stop companies from aggregating around news. Because I think with things like products, it makes sense because that's how they make money and they wouldn't exist if they couldn't do it. Fine. But when it comes to news, there's no need. And I think public good and the safeguarding of democracy is frankly more important than someone's profit margin. And these companies make huge amounts of money. So I think there is a lot of onus on government, but at the same time, we need to take also responsibility and take those tools that are hopefully going to be taught in school soon and use them throughout our lives.
So basically, you haven't said the two dreaded words, fake news, that everybody uses all the time. So fake news, it's interesting. It's an interesting term for me because we have been, the news and politicians, basically anyone has been using information, has been fabricating information or using it to, persuade or entertain or confuse people. We can think of propaganda during the war and such. So what would be the difference between fake news then and fake news now?
So how would I qualify fake news today? I mean, the fundamental difference, I think, is how easy it is to create and what is the determination of fake news. I don't think there is much difference other than technology and the ability to create it new, because none of this stuff is unique to the modern day. I think we're more aware of it, ironically, now. But at the same time, it's harder to detect. So I think we know this is happening, but it's hard to detect. Whereas before, people believed things because they came from what seemed to be official sources, but they could be propaganda, they could be misinformation, and so forth. But it was much harder to create. You didn't have individuals creating it themselves. And I think that's a fundamental difference. The one issue I find with fake news is that, first of all, it's politicized to hell and back. And it's often a term that people use for things they don't like. You know, so if you don't like a certain statement, whether it's true or not, you call it fake news. There are certain politicians that do this quite regularly. Can't name any names. The way I'd qualify it, and I think we need to qualify it better, and the way it is through something called the three main categories, which is disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. Misinformation is the more regular one, which is where people share things that aren't true or misinformed, but essentially by accident. So causing damage almost by accident. So to give you, or for satire, to give you an example, the 5G conspiracy theory was quite a big one in the UK, especially at the beginning of lockdown and the pandemic. And it was actually spread by a couple of minor celebrities that didn't realize this wasn't true. They're spreading misinformation. They weren't doing it necessarily to harm anyone. They genuinely believed this was an issue and they shared it without reading or whatever, or doing any other fact checking. But that's qualified as misinformation. Disinformation is kind of like propaganda, where it's created specifically to influence someone in a negative way. So, for example, I would personally class the Breaking Point poster of the migrants coming across the border and coming into the UK and all this kind of nonsense. I was classed that as disinformation. The people that created it knew categorically that wasn't true, but they used it to influence people in a certain way. Just kind of like misinformation, but in a negative way, created purposely to deceive someone. And then malinformation, which is probably the more confusing one, is true information that is used out of context to essentially attack or denigrate someone. So we did a CPD session with journalists in Moldova, in the Republic of Moldova, not too long ago, again during lockdown. And one example that they gave when we were talking about malinformation was that one of their candidates for one of their elections was an unmarried woman. And being unmarried in the Republic of Moldova is not seen as okay for a woman of a certain age, especially if she has kids, etc., etc. And the problem with that was that they brought it up consistently, every debate, everywhere, that she was unmarried. Again, it's a true fact, but it's completely not relevant to what she's talking about, hence malinformation. But I think it's important to make those distinctions. And today we're a lot more aware of the differences. And I think fake news doesn't really give that justice. So especially we in the media literacy practitioner space kind of move away from that term in general. Whereas in the past, it's primarily propaganda run by either state organizations or private sector bodies, essentially. Like the individuals creating it wasn't really a thing at the same level as it is now.
Thank you. So to wrap things up, you mentioned before that media literacy should be taught in school, but as well in some way or form by the government. So how could they achieve that? Because, for example, on Shout Out UK, there's a whole section about media literacy, so the Media Literacy Center. So basically, you guys go to school and teach about media literacy, is that right?
Yep. Yeah.
How could the government help in doing that?
So I think it needs to be, and this is something I'm quite strong about. I think we need to have, and this is probably more of an England and Wales solution, but I mean, you can technically replicate it in any country. You just got to obviously fit the educational context. But I'd say that what needs to happen is a GCSE or equivalent needs to be created in political literacy, media literacy, where it's given the correct time in the curriculum, and people learn. Young people learn about these things so that when they hit 16, i.e. the age of registering to vote, they have these tools already. So they're formulating their opinions based on critical evidence, as opposed to just hearing what their parents say or hearing what some random Twitter account says, or whatever else. But it needs to be given the time of day as a proper subject in schools that has the same weight as something like history or English in the UK, or maths, for example, because these are real life skills that aren't just useful for yourself or in our democracy, but are useful, as I said, for public health, are useful for your job. Like, if you need to know how to critically analyze information to do pretty much any job. So I think it needs to be a core subject. Whereas now, when we come in and teach it, it often gets fit into something called enrichment, which is mixed in with a load of different subjects. And there's often not enough time to go into proper detail. And I think that's something that governments need to really step up. I mean, the educational curriculum in general in the UK needs serious revamping for a variety of reasons. But I'd say that's a core one. And we can see it consistently since the pandemic, why it needs to be taught.
Definitely, 100%. Okay, well, that was it for me then.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here today and talking to us. That's going to be very interesting to share on social media, definitely. So thanks a lot.
Amazing. Thanks a lot. Take care.